Welcome back, fellow mages, to a bonus episode of the Grounded Mage where we explore how myth and magic exist in everyday life. Today, we are talking about pirates, specifically the crew at the heart of One Piece, the legendary Straw Hat Pirates. And if you're just stepping into this world before the next season drops, don't worry. I'm only going to focus on the original 5 crew members, the psychological ecosystem that makes this pirate family actually work. And just so you know, I won't be giving specific examples in this episode just because I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who maybe hasn't seen season 1 yet, or for anyone who's planning on starting the anime, which is a wild ride that I highly recommend you go on. Anyway, our crew today includes Monkey D. Luffy, Roronoa Zoro, Nami, Usopp, and Sanji. Now, on the surface, this is a chaotic group, and they are just chasing treasure. But psychologically, they represent something incredibly powerful: found family. A group of people who weren't born together, but who choose each other anyway. And the reason the Straw Hats work so well isn't random. Each member fills a psychological and mythological role that balances the others. Think of it like a ship. If everyone tried to steer, the ship just goes in circles. But if everyone brings a different skill, you actually make it across the ocean. Mages, we will start, of course, with the captain. Monkey D. Luffy might seem like the least qualified captain in pirate history. He's impulsive and easily distracted, and his long term strategy seems to be punch the problem until it goes away. But psychologically, Luffy possesses one of the most powerful leadership traits that we know about: authenticity. Research in leadership psychology shows that people are more likely to follow someone who feels genuine rather than someone who just feels competent. Luffy doesn't pretend to be impressive. He doesn't posture. He doesn't manipulate. He simply is exactly who he is. And that authenticity creates a psychological safety for everyone around him. Psychological safety is the concept that people perform better in groups where they feel accepted and safe to express themselves. And Google actually studied hundreds of teams to determine what made them successful, and the biggest factor was not how smart they were. It was whether or not they felt safe enough to be themselves. Luffy creates that environment naturally. He doesn't ask people to fit a mold. He invites them to be their weirdest, truest selves, which is why the crew becomes fiercely loyal to him. Now, mythologically speaking, Luffy fits into a fascinating archetype. He's what we might call the trickster king. Across mythology, we see characters who break rules and reshape the world through chaos. Think of trickster figures like Loki, Hermes, Anansi, who are all characters we actually talked about in season 1, so go check those out after you're done with this episode. These figures disrupt systems that have become stagnant. They're unpredictable, playful, and sometimes they're a little reckless. But their chaos opens the door to transformation. Luffy fits right into that lineage. He doesn't conquer the world through control. He changes it by refusing to play by its rules. So, let me ask you this. Where in your life are you trying too hard to fit someone else's expectations? And what would it look like to lead with authenticity instead of approval? Next, we have the swordsman, Roronoa Zoro. If Luffy is chaos and freedom, Zoro is discipline. He represents the warrior archetype. In myth, warriors are not just fighters, they're guardians of purpose. Think about mythological figures like Achilles, Beowulf, and Thor. These characters embody strength, but their strength comes from devotion to a goal. Zoro's goal is simple and straightforward: become the greatest swordsman in the world. And psychologically, that kind of clarity is incredibly powerful. Psychologist Angela Duckworth describes grit as the combination of passion and perseverance toward a long term goal. Zoro is essentially grit personified. He endures pain, failure, exhaustion, and simply keeps moving forward. But there's another fascinating level to Zoro's psychology. Despite his strength, he willingly chooses loyalty. In many stories, warriors struggle with pride, but Zoro places his loyalty to Luffy above his own ego. That creates stability in the crew. Social psychology research shows that teams break down when everyone competes for status. Zoro's loyalty removes that tension. He becomes the anchor of the crew, the person who holds the line when things get chaotic. And let's be honest, in One Piece, they often get chaotic. So, what goal in your life deserves that level of commitment? And what would happen if you pursued it with Zoro level dedication? It would be really tough to have a crew without someone who knows how to get you where you want to go. So, let's talk about our navigator, Nami. Nami is one of the most psychologically realistic characters in the entire crew. Because Nami isn't driven by adventure, she's driven by survival. Her obsession with money and control makes perfect sense through the lens of trauma psychology. When people grow up in environments where safety and stability are uncertain, they often develop something called hyper independence, which we talked about a little bit in my last episode. So go check that one out. After you're done with this one, it's going to be linked in the description down below. Hyper independent people believe that relying on others is dangerous. So they learn to rely on themselves. Money becomes security, control becomes protection, trust becomes risky. Nami embodies that survival strategy perfectly. But the Straw Hat crew slowly introduces something to her world: trust that isn't transactional. And that allows her to begin healing. Mythologically, Nami fits into the archetype of the clever survivor. Think of characters like Odysseus or Medea. These figures survive dangerous worlds not through brute force, but through intelligence, strategy, and adaptability. Nami navigates both literal storms and emotional ones. So, where in your life have you learned to only rely on yourself? And what would it take for you to let someone else help you carry the map? Next up is our sniper, Usopp. Now, Nami was our most psychologically realistic character on the crew, but Usopp is definitely the most psychologically relatable character on the crew. Because unlike the others, Usopp doesn't feel heroic. He feels afraid, like all the time. And that fear makes him lie. Usopp tells stories about heroic deeds he hasn't actually done. But this behavior is surprisingly understandable through psychology. Humans construct narratives about who we are, and sometimes those narratives are aspirational. We tell stories about the person we hope to become. So, in a strange way, Usopp is practicing future identity. He tells stories about bravery until eventually he starts living them. Mythologically, Usopp aligns with the bard archetype. Characters like Orpheus or the Dogda, storytellers who shape reality through narrative. And psychologically, storytelling is incredibly powerful. Studies show that people who frame their struggles as part of a larger story are more resilient. Usopp's stories don't just entertain the crew, they help him become the hero he imagines himself to be. So, what story are you telling yourself about who you are? And is it empowering you or limiting you? Now, here's the fascinating thing about the Straw Hats. Each character alone is interesting, but together they form something much more powerful. They create a balanced ecosystem of human strengths. And there's one more character who completes that balance. Enter the cook, Sanji. Sanji's defining trait isn't his fighting ability, although no one can deny that it's very helpful in almost every situation. But it's his compassion that really defines him. Sanji feeds people. And it sounds really simple, almost like it shouldn't matter that much, but feeding people is one of the oldest human bonding rituals. Anthropologists have found that sharing food has been central to human social groups for tens of thousands of years. Food creates trust, community, and emotional warmth. Sanji embodies the caregiver archetype, a figure found across mythologies in characters who nurture and protect others. Think of mythological figures like Demeter or Gaia. In many traditions, cooks and hosts are sacred roles because they sustain the community. Sanji keeps the crew physically alive, but he also keeps them emotionally grounded. Even pirates need to eat dinner. And sometimes the greatest act of care isn't a heroic sacrifice. Sometimes it's just making sure that everybody eats. How do you nurture the people around you? What's your version of Sanji's kitchen? So, when we zoom out, we can see the psychological balance within the Straw Hat crew. Luffy brings freedom and inspiration. Zoro brings discipline and loyalty. Nami offers intelligence and survival instincts. Usopp brings imagination and courage. And Sanji nurtures and protects the group. Together, they create what psychologists would call a highly complementary team. Each member fills the gaps left by the others. And that's the secret of every great crew. Nobody does everything, but everyone brings something essential. So here's my final question for you, fellow mages. If you were a pirate crew member, what role would you play? The dreamer, the warrior, the survivor, the storyteller, the caretaker? Or is the real magic realizing that at different points in our lives, we become each of them? Thank you for joining me on this short and sweet bonus episode of The Grounded Mage. Again, this just covers the original 5 crew members. There's also Chopper, Robin, Frankie, Brooke, and Jinbei. And if you'd like me to explore them in a future episode, let me know in a comment. If you enjoyed today's episode, please engage with it somehow. Leave a comment, give it a like. It really helps this channel find people who want and need to hear these things. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you don't miss future explorations into mythology, psychology, and the stories that shape us. And if you know someone who's diving into One Piece before the next season drops, send this episode their way because every crew deserves a navigator. Until next time, fellow mages, make it make magic.